Economists focus on opportunity costs when we're trying to measure cost, and particularly we're focused on explicit and implicit costs of a firm. In other words, you can describe all the costs of a firm as either explicit or implicit. Explicit are pretty easy to estimate, and most firms get this accurately. Explicit costs are out-of-pocket costs. For instance, if I buy raw materials from one of my suppliers, I pay them out of my pocket, that's an explicit cost, goes right on the books. If I hire a new person, the wage rate that I pay them is an explicit cost, it goes right on the books. Those are very easy to estimate. It's the implicit costs we're not always so accurate on. Implicit costs are not out-of-pocket costs. So for instance, what is the opportunity cost of my time? Well, the answer would be whatever somebody else was willing to pay me. But in fact, they didn't actually pay me, and there's no actual dollars being transferred there. We're asking, what would they have paid me? What's the best salary I could have got working for somebody else rather than in my own firm? It may also, though, be the cost of materials that I own. It could be equipment. It could be cars. It could be machines. What could I have sold them or rented them out to for somebody else? What about my building? I could have rented that to somebody else. What would that have been worth to me? We need to account for those things. In other words, if we're going to determine whether we made a profit this year or not, we don't just look at what we paid out of our pocket, we look at what we gave up to produce this year. So as a simple example, suppose my revenue is $200,000 and my implicit costs will wait for a second. What about my explicit cost? Easy. Suppose those are $100,000. I've got those accurate to the penny. Then the question would be, okay, I've covered my explicit cost. I've made $100,000 above that. Did I make a profit or not? Well, let's make it as simple as we can. Let's suppose the only thing you brought into your company was yourself and your time. Suppose somebody else would have paid you $150,000. You have $100,000 left after you paid off all your workers. You could have done better working for somebody else. You made an economic loss of $50,000, even though on the books it looks like you made a profit. Suppose I could have worked for somebody else for $100,000. Well, I didn't really make a zero profit. What I did was cover all of my opportunity costs. Economists would call that a normal profit. We've covered the best alternatives available to us. What if I could have only worked for somebody else for $50,000? Then I made what's called an economic profit. I did better than my best alternative. From a standpoint of economic decision making and also from a standpoint of making predictions, economists really need to know whether you made an economic profit, a normal profit, or an economic loss. What's on the books isn't enough. Now, in the short run, there are obviously many different cost categories. We've got fixed, variable costs. We've got average fixed, average variable, average total cost, marginal cost. But in the micro section of the course, we really focus a lot on the margin. And I'll give you an example of why we care so much about this. Our goal is to maximize profits. Suppose the next unit costs us $5 to produce. Suppose the next unit adds $6 to our revenue. We've added $1 to our profits. Our total profit is rising. Suppose the next unit costs $5 to produce. It only adds $4 to our revenue. Our profit is actually falling. Now, the averages are important because they help us calculate whether we made a total profit or not. But the marginals tell us the most important thing, whether our profit is rising or falling. And if our objective is to maximize profits, we don't look at the total, we look at what direction the total is going. In other words, is the total falling? Is the total rising? And if our total profit is rising, it tells me we're now adding more to our revenue than we are to our costs on the additional units we produce at the margin. Okay, so economists are focused on that marginal cost, and when you go to the next chapter and you look at the golden rule of profit maximization, you're going to see it's all about the margin. There is a link between the marginals and the averages. There is no link between the marginal and the average fixed cost, though. Or for that matter, the total fixed cost. Fixed costs don't change as output changes. Marginals, by definition, are measured as output changes. Marginal costs are a form of variable costs. They're not related to fixed costs. They are related to the variable cost. And if the marginal cost, the cost of the next unit, is below the average, then when we add this next unit into our average, we'll see our average will fall. the marginal cost is above our average, when we add it into our average, we'll see our average will start to rise. So what that tells us, if our marginal cost is below average, average is falling. If marginal is above average, average variable cost is rising. It also might suggest to you, if you think about it and look at the pictures in the book, that when the marginal intersects the average variable cost, you must be at the minimum of the average variable. If it's below the average variable is falling. If it's above the average variable is rising. They intersect at the minimum. The same is true of the relationship between the marginal cost and the average total. If the next unit adds an amount to our cost less than our average total, it will fall. If it adds an amount to our cost greater than the average, then our average will rise, our average total will rise. So if the marginal cost is below average total, it's falling. If it's above average total, it's rising, and they intersect at a minimum. The short run and the long run are important to us. The long run is a different situation than the short run. The long run is planning. The long run, all costs can change. Therefore, there are no fixed costs in the long run. We can change everything. But there's a question I love to ask students about the long run. That relates to the issue of the optimum plant size. In the short run, it seems to at least make intuitive sense that we would want to produce at the minimum of the average total cost. Now, sorry, but it's not quite as intuitive as you might think, because if our objective is to maximize profits, maximizing profits and producing at the lowest point on our average total cost curve are not exactly the same thing, and you'll see more of that in the next chapter. I want you to think about that now. So our objective is maximize profits, not minimize average total cost. But at least it's plausible that we would want to produce at the minimum of the average total cost in the short run. Now, what about the long run? Suppose we're in the long run. Are we automatically doing the right thing if we produce at the minimum of the short run average total cost? The answer may well be no. If you look at the graph on page 167, look at the short run average total cost curve numbered 1. Go to the minimum point on that curve, which if you look close is not touching the long run average total cost curve, it's above it. Draw a dotted line down from that minimum to the horizontal axis. Now go back up. You'll see that the cost of producing at the short run average cost at its minimum point is higher than the point directly below it on the long run average cost curve. That tells you there's another plant, a bigger plant than short run average total cost 1, where you can produce the output level at the minimum of the short run average total cost 1 at a lower cost on a bigger plant 1 just tangent to the long run average cost. So what that suggests is, in the long run, the optimal plant size is not the minimum of the short run average cost. The optimal plant size is the plant just tangent to the long run average total cost curve at the output you want to produce. But of course there is a place, look at the picture, where being at the minimum point on the short run average total cost curve is the right place to be, is the right plant to produce. Look at output Q1. If I wanted to produce output Q1, I'd want to produce it on short run average total cost curve 2. The short run average cost curve 2 is just tangent to the long run average cost curve, directly above output 1. The minimum point on short run average cost curve 2 corresponds to the long run average cost curve, and it is the optimum plant size. Optimum plant size in the long run is defined as the lowest average cost of producing a given level of output, not the minimum point on the short run average cost. Okay, now we're going to move next week into competitive markets. We've actually already been there. At the beginning of the course, when we talked about supply and demand, that was competitive markets, and it's actually the only type of market structure where that model does describe the market accurately. It actually doesn't describe a monopoly market, which we'll also describe. So when we move into that chapter, I want you to think about the margin again. Start thinking about optimal plant size. Start thinking about profit maximization and using the margin.